In order to understand the world we live in today, it's to the past that we have to look. And we actually have to go back in time over 100 years, to the beginning of the 1900s, to put it all in proper context and get a better understanding of the world we live in today, and why. But it's pretty amazing when you think about it, that just over 100 years ago, the United States was still being joined together from coast to coast by the railroad companies. And the main mode of transportation in the cities, the bigger ones anyways, was the streetcars and the trolleys. Or horse and carriage. There were some cars around, but it wouldn't be until 1908 that would see Henry Ford mass-produce the Model T. Now, one thing that hasn't really changed in the last 100+ years are the kings of Wall Street. And going into the 1900s, these three families were the kings of Wall Street. And the history books tell us that these were families of great men that did unbelievable things, which can be seen in the fact that almost everybody in North America is familiar with these family names. But we're going to look into the history books a little bit deeper, and we'll see a lot more unbelievable stuff that you probably didn't know about these guys, along with some of their Wall Street buddies. And before we get going, we're going to have a look into the history of these three and how they rose to become the kings of Wall Street in the early 1900s. First, we'll have a look at the DuPonts. And most people today, when they think of the name DuPont, they might think of the chemical factories, or perhaps paint, or maybe materials like tarps and nylon. But it's the family history that's truly the most astounding. And while our main focus here will be on PRS DuPont and his two younger brothers throughout World War I and World War II, when you look to their family history to try to understand them a little bit better, what you find is truly incredible. And we have to go way back to a time before there even was a United States. And there we find Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, and he was PRS DuPont and his brother's great-great-grandfather, as well as being the patriarch of the family when they crossed the Atlantic in 1799 to come to America. So as we can see from biography.com, DuPont was involved in European affairs as well as French domestic politics. And he was also involved in the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution and established the United States' independence from Great Britain in 1783. So how about that? That's some pretty impressive credentials. And we're only just getting started. In 1789, the French Revolution would happen, which would change the DuPonts family's lives and fortunes. In 1799, DuPont emigrated to the United States with his second wife and his two sons, and their wives and their children who were born at that point as well. He associated with notable figures in American politics and economics, including Thomas Jefferson. In 1802, DuPont returned to France, which was then under the rule of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, and he helped to negotiate the French side of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And then, DuPont assisted with the banishment of Napoleon and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814. However, when Napoleon returned from exile the following year, DuPont promptly left France. And below we can see where he returned to the United States in 1815 and joined his son, Eleuther Irene, more commonly known as Irene. And he's the great-grandfather of our PRS DuPont in our story. And he's the one that founded the American DuPont Empire that we know today. So when we look at PRS DuPont, who was named after his great-great-grandfather, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, and when we look at the stuff that him and his son did, it's not hard to fathom that PRS DuPont and his brothers might think of themselves as sort of descended from American royalty. Now I want to point out something here. I saved these screenshots from biography.com a number of years ago on a different system with a different screen, of course, which is why they're not more like full screen. And as you can see, simply zooming in to get the full screen effect cuts off the text. So while making this, I decided to go back to biography.com and get fresh screen captures to make this section of the documentary full screen. And to my surprise, I've discovered they scrubbed the page. And we'll see a little bit later on why I find that to be a bit surprising. But for some reason, biography.com has scrubbed their biography on Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours. And just to confirm that, I did a search on their site, and it came up with no results. And in fact, if you do a search for just DuPont, all you get is a piece and a video on John DuPont, who would be like a fourth or fifth cousin to Pierre S. DuPont, and a mini biography video on the DuPonts. And for some reason, you also get biographies on Mark Ruffalo and Steve Carroll. And if you watch the video they have, the DuPonts mini biography, it's only like 2 minutes long, and it's crap. And we also hear from Pete DuPont, who was the grandson of the youngest brother, Lamont DuPont, and as you can see was a former governor of Delaware, naturally. And of course he just toes the company line during his quick interview. And the video, like the biography.com website itself, completely omits any mention of Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, with the video starting off by saying that it was his son, Eleuthère Irene, who first came to America, which is not exactly a full and true accounting of the history as we've seen. And it's almost like they're writing Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours right out of the history books. So naturally this only made me more curious, leaving me to wonder if maybe biography.com got stuff wrong, or perhaps maybe there's stuff they're trying to cover up. And the answer to both of those is no. They did get everything correct, and there's nothing really nefarious in the history, but instead it's rather spectacular. So let's go way back in the history books and have a look at E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, A History, 1802 to 1902, by B.G. DuPont, published 100 years ago in 1920. And B.G. DuPont is Bessie Gardner DuPont, wife to another in the DuPont family line, Alfred Irene DuPont. And we can see during the Reign of Terror, which happened during the French Revolution, Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours, the great-great-grandfather of Pierre S. DuPont, was almost guillotined. And we can also see that he held quite a few prestigious titles and positions, and was quite active in the politics of other European countries as well. And he had, with James Hutton, made the preliminary draft of the Treaty of 1783, by which England recognized the independence of the American states, which we saw on the now deleted biography.com page. Founding fathers Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were his friends. He left France in September of 1799 with his wife, who I don't have a picture of, his 2 sons and their wives, and their children, and it took them 95 days to cross the Atlantic, landing in Rhode Island on January 1st, 1800. And going to the bottom sentence of the second text box, we see when he arrived in New York, DuPont received a letter from Thomas Jefferson, on whose friendship he had counted for advice, and at that point, that would be Vice President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. And some of that advice would eventually lead the DuPonts to buy land in Wilmington, Delaware, where his son, Eleuthère Irene, would set up shop, founding the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company. We also see President Jefferson asked DuPont de Nemours to assist the American minister in his negotiations with Bonaparte and Talleyrand for the purchase of Louisiana. And for those who don't know, we're not talking about the modern state of Louisiana as we know it today. This is the Louisiana Purchase, which was almost 1/3 of the continental United States. And we also see April 1814, Napoleon abdicated, and the throne came back to the line of King Louis again, and DuPont was appointed Secretary of the Provisional Government, then Chevalier of the Legion of Honor and Counselor of State. But in the following March, however, Napoleon returned to Paris, the Bourbon government again collapsed, and in May 1815, DuPont de Nemours was in Delaware. So as you can see, pretty much everything we looked at in the biography.com website about Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours was right on the money. And having a look at his son, Eleuthère Irene, who founded E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company, and was Pierre S. DuPont's great-grandfather, we see that he began to study chemistry at the age of 16 in the laboratory of his father's friend who was in charge of making gunpowder for the French government. Then at the age of 29, shortly after arriving in the United States with his family, Eleuthère René went out shooting with Colonel Toussard, a friend of his brother Victor, who had come to America, and they shot away all their powder and had to buy a new supply, and the high price and bad quality of this powder impressed René DuPont, and as a result, the DuPont Empire in America would be born. And like father, like son, Eleuthère René was also a friend of Thomas Jefferson. And here's a letter to him from Thomas Jefferson, dated November 23, 1804, soon after the DuPont Powder Company was established. And Jefferson writes to DuPont saying, "It is with real pleasure I inform you that it is concluded to be for the public interest to apply your establishment for whatever can be had from that for the use of either the naval or the military department." And Thomas Jefferson wrote that as President of the United States, giving us perhaps our first look at what could be viewed at as an example of a military-industrial complex. Anyways, that DuPont relationship to Washington would carry through the War of 1812. And by the time the Civil War would roll around, the next generations of DuPonts would be taking over, with some of them serving in the war as well, including Pierre S. DuPont's great-uncle, Henry DuPont, who at that point was also at the head of the family and president of the DuPont Empire, as well as Pierre S. DuPont's father, Lamont DuPont I. And just to note, Alfred Victor DuPont, who was the firstborn son of Eleuthère René, and father of Lamont DuPont I, and grandfather of Pierre S. DuPont, died before the Civil War began, which is why we see his younger brother Henry DuPont as the head of the family and family business at that time. And then we see at the close of the Civil War, the members of the firm were Henry DuPont and his three nephews, Eleuthère René DuPont II, Lamont DuPont I, and Eugene DuPont. And here's how their relationships work. I also came across this DuPont catalog from 1927 that shows all the DuPont family members that ran the company since its beginning, and right on up to Pierre S. DuPont and his brothers, who would run it through World War I and into World War II. So as you can see, the name DuPont is far more than just a chemical factory, or a manufacturer of products such as nylon or polyester. The family line of prestige and wealth stretches back to a time before there even was a United States, and Pierre Samuel DuPont de Nemours was probably the closest thing you could get to being a founding father, without actually being named one of the founding fathers. And note that the DuPonts would also be a major supplier of powders and explosives for every war since the War of 1812, which is something that Pierre S. DuPont and his brothers would expand upon exponentially in World War I and World War II, as we'll see. So now we'll have a look at the Morgans. And in tracing the history of their banking empire, you have to go back to the 1830s, London, England, when American philanthropist George Peabody would move there in 1837. And by 1838, the banking firm of George Peabody and Company was born. Then in 1853, Junius Spencer Morgan would travel to London, England, meet George Peabody, and by 1854, George Peabody and Company would become Peabody Morgan and Company. And this would be the beginning of the Morgan banking empire, as Junius Spencer Morgan is the father and grandfather of the J.P. Morgans. As Peabody Morgan and Company would grow huge over the years, by 1863 they were headquartered in this building in London, and by 1864 George Peabody would retire, and Junius Spencer Morgan would take over the business, and Peabody Morgan and Company would then become J.S. Morgan and Company, which would then get passed down to John Pierpont Morgan Sr., or J.P. Morgan Sr. And notice the dates. We're in the 1860s, with J.P. Morgan Sr. being born in 1837, and by the age of 20 in 1857, he was working at Peabody Morgan and Company with his father, J.S. Morgan. And then at the age of 23, J.P. Morgan Sr. would move back to the United States in New York and would begin the foundations of the J. Pierpont Morgan and Company, acting as an agent for his father's company in London, which was now called J.S. Morgan and Company. But then a year later in 1861, the United States Civil War would break out. And as opposed to what we saw with the DuPonts in the Civil War, we see something very shady with J.P. Morgan Sr. during the Civil War. There was a scandal called the Hall Carbine Affair. And what we have here is a book about it by an author, R. Gordon Wasson, published back in 1948. And in it, we can see J. Pierpont Morgan is alleged to have sold the government some condemned arms at a profit. And the author, R. Gordon Wasson, says, "In this book we shall prove that the alleged transaction, insofar as the case against Morgan is concerned, is legend, not history." So, again, that was published in 1948. And then I see in 1971, the same author publishes The Hall Carbine Affair, an essay in historiography. And then I see in 2017, the original 1948 book is republished as a paperback. So I noticed they've been pushing this narrative for over 70 years now, and I wondered, well, who is R. Gordon Wasson? And when I went to look in to see who he was, lo and behold, I find out he's the Vice President for Public Relations at J.P. Morgan & Company. Go figure. And even though he died in 1986, as you can see, over 30 years later, they're still pushing his narrative. And that narrative being that the allegations that J.P. Morgan Sr. sold condemned arms to the government is only legend, and it's not history. So if you've watched any of my other documentary videos, you'll know that this is something that's just going to make me want to dive into it even deeper and try to dig into the real truth of the matter. Because I'm not going to just take the Vice President for Public Relations at J.P. Morgan & Company's word for it. So naturally, I started digging in, and I found the second session of the 37th Congress, printed in 1862. And in it, they investigate the entire scandal. So let's have a look. And we can see on the 25th of August, 1857, the entire military was ordered to inspect and condemn unserviceable ordnance stores. And in the list of the condemned ordnance was all the Hall's arms then belonging to the United States, which would mean all the Hall carbine rifles and their accessories, which were all to be sold off at a public auction, in which 5,000 of them would end up in the J.P. Morgan scandal. So we can see from Brigadier General James W. Ripley, the Hall carbines in question were sold to Mr. Eastman. And Arthur Eastman, along with another guy named Simon Stevens, are a couple of operators in this scandal that was ultimately financed by J.P. Morgan Sr. So anyways, Brigadier General James Ripley goes on to say, "I recommended to the Secretary that the whole number on hand, including damaged ones, be sold to him for $3.50 each. This recommendation was approved, and Mr. Eastman was authorized to receive the arms upon paying to the officers who had them in charge the price agreed upon." And we see right below that Arthur Eastman's original offer to buy the guns, dated May 28, 1861, where he says, "I now propose to purchase the entire lot at $3 each. Signed, A.M. Eastman, sent to then Colonel Ripley." And then the next day, on May 29, 1861, we see then Lieutenant Colonel of the Ordnance, James Ripley, writing to the Secretary of War, saying, "I consider the carbines worth $3.50 each, and recommend their sale if all, of every quality or condition, are taken at the average of $3.50. To which the Secretary of War replied, "Approved." So the conditions of the deal get back to Arthur Eastman, and on June 5, 1861, he replies, "Sir, I accept your proposition to sell me the Hall's firearms at $3.50 each." Now, fast forward a couple of months, and we see the entry in the account current of Captain R.H.K. Whitley, New York Arsenal, crediting himself with money received in payment of Hall's carbines is as follows. August 7th, 1861, amount of draft on Assistant Treasurer in New York from J. Pierpont Morgan, Esquire, in payment for Hall's carbines purchased by A.M. Eastman, $17,486. And when you do the math on that, that translates to 4,996 rifles at $3.50 each. And in the overall deal, they would buy over 5,000 rifles, but everything was contingent on how many working ones there were, which turned into 4,996 of them. But working or not, they were deemed not measuring up to the U.S. military standards, hence they were for sale. But take note of the date, August 7, 1861. That's when J.P. Morgan would pay for the Hall's carbines purchased by Arthur Eastman. And part of the deal was that the guns wouldn't be released to Eastman until full payment was made, which means that those guns were officially the property of the United States military until August 7, 1861. So now check this out. On August 5th, 1861, Arthur Eastman's buddy, Simon Stevens, sends a telegraph stating, I have 5,000 Hall's rifled cast steel carbines, breech loading, new, at $22. And take a guess who he's trying to sell these rifles to. Yep, the U.S. military. And we see the next day on August 6, 1861, Major General J.C. Fremont of St. Louis responds, "I will take the whole 5,000 carbines." So how do you like that? These are the same guns that Arthur Eastman and J.P. Morgan bought from the U.S. military at $3.50 each, and haven't paid for yet. And yet there's Arthur Eastman's friend Simon Stevens, who J.P. Morgan also knows, offering to sell those very same guns back to the U.S. military 2 days before Morgan would pay for them. And his deal would be accepted by the Western Department headquarters in St. Louis the next day. So remember, this is 1861. They didn't have computers or even telephones back then. So there's no way that Major General J.C. Fremont could have known that these were the same carbines that were taken out of service already by the U.S. military. Plus, the telegraph from Simon Stevens is listing them as new and up to government standards. And they almost got away with it, and well, technically they did get away with it overall, but at least they got caught. And how they got caught was Congress was looking into wartime profiteering and just happened to come across these sales. So fast forward in their investigation to the next year, and we see on June 4th, 1862, Mr. A.M. Eastman, having appeared before the commission and being duly sworn, was asked by the commission, and if we look down at the second question, which was, "Were not these carbines the same which you purchased from the United States at $3.50 each?" And Eastman's answer, "They were." So these were the same 5,000 guns, which didn't meet the U.S. military standards, which is why they sold them for $3.50 each, only to have Stevens and Eastman turn around and sell them back to the U.S. military for $22 each. So here we can see Congress spelling out the entire scam, that on June 5th, 1861, Mr. Eastman agreed to purchase these carbines at the price of $3.50. And then when Stevens offered these arms to General Fremont, namely August 5th, and when General Fremont accepted the offer, namely August 6th, the arms were still the property of the United States. And remember, that's because J.P. Morgan didn't pay for them until August 7th, 1861. So they go on to say the proposal actually was to sell the government at $22 each, 5,000 of its own arms. The intention being, if the offer was accepted, to obtain these arms by purchase from the government at $3.50 each. That intention was carried out, lacking 4 carbines only, which is that 4,996 number, if you'll remember from earlier. So they go on to say, if the purchase made by General Fremont is to be regarded as a valid purchase by the United States, the government not only sold one day for $17,486 arms for which it had agreed the day before to repurchase for $109,912, making a loss to the United States on the transaction of $92,426. So, how do you like that deal? And here's a receipt from the United States to J. Pierpont Morgan for half of the guns at $22 each. And notice the date, August 7th, 1861. So the same day J.P. Morgan was buying 5,000 of these rifles from the U.S. military for $17,486, he was receiving a receipt acknowledgement from the U.S. military for $58,175 in the first half of a deal that would see those very same guns being sold right back to the U.S. military. On April 14, 1862, Simon Stevens appeared before the commission, and he confirmed the dates that the deal he made with General Fremont was consummated August 6th, and that the number of arms sold was 5,000, and that he offered the 5,000 arms to General Fremont on August 5th by telegram. And then he was asked, having forwarded the lot of 2,500, did you get paid for them at once? If so, when and how? And Simon Stevens answers saying, Mr. Morgan was paid by check, dated I think September 10th, 1861. So, there's a whole lot more that went on with this scandal, but you get the idea. And J.P. Morgan and friends sent the second shipment of guns to the U.S. military, But then Congress began investigating the deals, and the government refused to make payment on that second shipment. And Morgan and friends, being stubborn and wanting their money, especially Morgan, who would also want to clear his name of any wrongdoing, would actually sue the government for the other $58,175 taken it to the Supreme Court in 1867. And, somehow, they would win. But the bottom line is that J.P. Morgan Sr. did indeed finance a scam deal that saw the U.S. military buying back its own guns at hugely inflated costs. And R. Gordon Wasson and the printing houses can publish and republish book after book all they like, saying that they'll prove the case against Morgan is legend and not history. And I suppose I should expect nothing less from the former Vice President for Public Relations at J.P. Morgan and Company, right? But they prove no such thing, and the bottom line is that the case against J.P. Morgan is in actuality fact, not legend. These deals did happen, and J.P. Morgan did finance them. And this happened right at the beginning of the Civil War, no less. Armies of hundreds of thousands would be raised and sent off to slaughter each other in a war that would nearly rip the country in half. And for 4 long years, the battles would intensify, resulting in casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands on both sides. These are the names you hear about from the Civil War, and with good reason. This was definitely a pivotal point not only in the history of the country, but the world as well. And remember that we also saw that members of the DuPont family were actively enlisted in the war as well. Though without doing the research for this, I would never have known that. And they were all fighting on the side of the Union, of course. And there's J.P. Morgan right in the middle of it all, ripping the Union off. So in 1867, Morgan's buddy Stevens won a judgment, and by 1868, he was paid the other half of the deal, plus interest, totaling $61,577. And that would be the end of the Hall Carbine affair. And like we're going to see so much of in this series, there's no accountability for it. And don't forget that J.P. Morgan's father was at the head of one of the most influential international banking firms that was operating out of England, with J.P. Morgan and his J. Pierpont Morgan and Company acting as the American representatives of that firm. So it would seem that back then, much like today, the rich and powerful just aren't held to account. Anyways, after the Civil War had ended, J.P. Morgan teamed up with banker Anthony Joseph Drexel, and in 1871 they formed Drexel Morgan and Company. And by 1873, they were headquartered out of this famous corner of Wall Street. And after the deaths of his father in 1890 and his partner Anthony Joseph Drexel in 1893, in 1895, Drexel Morgan and Company would become J.P. Morgan and Company. And J.P. Morgan would also be in full control of his father's firm out in England, J.S. Morgan and Company. And then by 1910, J.P. Morgan would reduce his ownership in the London branch to 50%, and the name would change to Morgan Grenfell and Company. And to note, John Pierpont Morgan Jr., or J.P. Morgan Jr., who we'll be taking a good look at in this series as we go. And he, just like his father, learned the banking business right from a young age from his father, and naturally took over everything after his father died in 1913. And by 1934, he would drop most of his ownership in the London branch, and the name would be changed to Morgan Grenfell and Company Limited. And after more mergers and buyouts, etc., today it's become the entity we know as Deutsche Bank. And also to note about their famous building on Wall Street, the Drexel Building, or as more people came to know it as, the J.P. Morgan Building. See this building here? That's the New York Stock Exchange, right across the road from J.P. Morgan and Company headquarters.
It's all about location, location, location.
Indeed, and I can't argue with that. Anyways, J.P. Morgan Jr. would close the doors on the famous building on March 31st, 1913, the day his father died. And on April 1st, 1913, there was a sign placed on the front door that said, "Closed on account of the death of Mr. J.P. Morgan." The building would be torn down by June 1913, and this would be the building put in place by 1914, which is how we see it today. And today, J.P. Morgan and Company has morphed into J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the U.S. So, that's a look at the Morgans. Now let's have a look at the Rockefellers. And unlike Pierre S. DuPont or J.P. Morgan Sr., it was John D. Rockefeller who gave rise to the Rockefeller Empire that we've seen over the last 100 years, of course through his Standard Oil Company. But like the DuPonts, when it comes to family members, there's a whole whack of Rockefellers too. And we'll just have a quick look at a few of them as we run through the family line. There was John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was the fifth-born child and only son of John D. Rockefeller and his wife Laura. And he would of course be a director at his father's company, Standard Oil, but we would also see that he would become a director at J.P. Morgan's U.S. Steel, a company we're going to have a look at coming up. So anyways, John D. Rockefeller Jr. would have 6 children, and amongst them would be Nelson Rockefeller, who would go on to be governor of New York, and then vice president of the United States, and his brother, Winthrop Rockefeller, who would go on to be governor of Arkansas, go figure. And then of course there's David Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s youngest child, and he would get into banking in 1946 with Chase National Bank, which was pretty much considered the family bank at the time. And after a merger with the Manhattan Company, they would become Chase Manhattan, and then in the year 2000 they would merge with J.P. Morgan, and that's what gives us today our J.P. Morgan Chase. So anyways, as we go, we'll also see John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s brothers, William Avery Rockefeller Jr., whose son Percy Rockefeller we're going to take a look at, and John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s other brother, Frank Rockefeller, who plays a very important part in this story overall, as we're going to see coming up. And to note, John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s net worth, at one point, around 1913 or so, was worth $400 billion in adjusted dollars today, making him probably the richest person in history since the days of the pharaohs. So, that's some of the background of what I term as the Kings of Wall Street, who along with their family members and other bankers and industrialists also holding seats on the New York Stock Exchange in the early 1900s, would collectively become known as the robber barons. And we see some familiar faces in this 1930s lithograph by Bernardo Bryson, including Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller Sr., J.P. Morgan Sr., and E.H. Harriman. And as we can see from the cartoons of them at the time, the robber barons weren't very favored by the public at large. Now something interesting is that in the early 1900s, one place you could find all the kings of the kings, the top dogs of Wall Street, mingling and hanging out together, would be at the New York Stock Exchange, where owning a seat at the exchange was considered prestigious and a way to flaunt your wealth. So in the early 1900s, of course, we'd see the kings of Wall Street owning seats there, like John D. Rockefeller, E.H. Harriman, and J.P. Morgan, and another Wall Street tycoon that you probably never heard of, Bernard Baruch. And you'll note down below that Forbes correctly states about owning a seat on the exchange. At the end of the last century, meaning coming out of the 1800s and into the 1900s, seat ownership meant belonging to an exclusive club. And I most certainly can't argue against that. Coming up, we're going to have a look at a series of congressional investigations called the War Expenditure Hearings that took place immediately following World War I. These investigations went on for a 3-year period from 1919 to 1921. And though there isn't a complete surviving set of these documents to be found anywhere, if you go from university to university, you can download different volumes from the different years and piece together over 15,000 pages worth of the investigation. And when you read through it and put it all together and combine it with stuff we now know from hindsight as well, the information contained in these documents is quite spectacular, as we'll see, including the testimony given by Bernard Baruch, who stated, among other things, "I probably had more power than perhaps any other man did in the war. Doubtless that is true." And in the coming chapters, you're going to see why he would make a statement like that. But considering we're talking about World War I here, or the Great War as he would have known it, that's quite the bold statement to make, don't you think? But it's also quite accurate, as you'll soon discover. And I do find it pretty interesting that today, most people have never heard of Bernard Baruch, a man who in World War I probably had more power than perhaps any other man did in the war.